I'm here with William Hudson, a political science professor at Providence College. Professor Hudson, this election has, of course, been unlike something we've ever really seen before, and some names have been made for themselves out of relative obscurity. One of those candidates, of course, is Bernie Sanders, and he's extremely popular among young voters. And I know in your novel you discuss creating very thoughtful constituents, especially college and younger aged voters. Do you think that the Bernie fever, especially with popularity among younger voters, do you think that's legitimate or well-reasoned, or do you think it's an impulse sort of mad at the government?
I don't think Bernie's voters are mad at the government. I think they are, I think he's tapped into issues that a lot of young people are concerned about. Concerned about economic inequality, concerned about being able to pay college tuition. He's done a very good job, I think, of crafting a campaign that appeals to a lot of young people. Also, I think young people are more open to sort of his more radical vision of America. One thing we know about the so-called millennials is that they are very, very far to the left. That was a constituency that strongly supported Barack Obama, and this wave of people coming along, I think, are attracted to the notion that maybe the economic system isn't working out so well. I saw a poll recently, or I saw a report on a poll that said that among people, I can't remember exactly the age range, but under age 34 or something, right. Said that they had very favorable views of socialism. Okay. Now, that's kind of astounding in America, right, where usually, I mean, traditionally socialism has been held up as this kind of awful thing. I mean, the Republicans tried to undermine Obama by accusing him of being a socialist. Obama was very far from being a socialist. And Bernie Sanders really isn't a socialist either in the traditional sense. He's what I would call a social democrat. Okay. He's like he says himself, you know, countries like Denmark or Sweden are his models, you know, not the old Soviet Union.
So it's a little bit of a different interpretation, what Republicans are trying to say a socialist as a Soviet Union socialist, whereas what he's aiming for is more of the Swedish Democrat. Right.
He's interested in, he's not interested really in overthrowing free markets totally, but he's interested in strong government programs that provide ways for people to reduce the risks that they face in life. Like something like universal college and tuition, so that people can get a college education that they need to succeed in the economy today without having to burden themselves with enormous debt. That should be a public responsibility to educate our populace. We don't make 10-year-olds go in debt to get a 5th grade education. We say that's public education, that the society needs to educate its children. Well, nowadays, you know, you need to, I think, educate students through college as well. And most countries around the world do that. We're one of the only countries that don't provide, you know, free higher education to our citizens, at least in the industrial world. I think, you know, he's promoting that kind of a policy. Free child care, for example. I think that's one policy that would probably do more to alleviate poverty than anything else. To make it possible for women, particularly women, single mothers, to have an opportunity to provide care to their children so that they can work.
And despite all of these amazing idealistic, you would say, ideas or progressive ideas, voter turnout for young people who often favor Bernie Sanders is still relatively low. Do you think that that will continue in the Democratic convention and primaries? And even in the general election, do you think that even if Bernie isn't nominated, young voters will have low voter turnouts, or will it be the opposite?
Younger people always vote at lower levels than older people. And the reasons are pretty, you know, understandable. Young people often are more mobile. They've maybe moved into a city just recently. They may have just gotten out of college and they've gone and got a first job somewhere. They're not really settled and maybe haven't gotten around to registering and voting.
Right.
And we find, I mean, this has always been true, that people start voting in higher percentages the older they get. So it's the segment of the population that is most likely to vote are actually people over age 65. It stops dropping off when people get very elderly,
right.
and it's more difficult to get to the polls. But you know, the older citizens have been around. The other factor is people. The biggest predictor of whether or not you'll vote in an election is if you voted before.
Really? And
younger people maybe haven't taken that first step to vote. Once they do, then they're more likely to vote again, et cetera, et cetera. And so as people age, more and more people begin to vote the first time, and then they will maintain that habit throughout their lives. Okay, so it's not surprising that young people the turnout is low. Also, in the primaries, turnout is always very low among all groups.
And why is that, do you think?
Because people necessarily don't pay a lot of attention to politics, even in this election, as amazing it could be. And also, primaries, it's sometimes hard to understand exactly when your state is going to vote. I, for example, could not tell you when the Rhode Island primary is going to be. It's sometime late April. I'm not sure. I think it's maybe the last Tuesday in April,
right.
But I'm not even sure. And I'm a political scientist. And so I think people just don't, it's more confusing, and so they don't participate at greater levels. Participation will go up in the general election. Now, what we want to look for in the general election is whether or not young people turn out at the kind of levels that they turned out for Barack Obama. We did see, although young people, even in 2008, 2012, voted at lower percentages than older people, they did vote at higher levels than in some previous presidential campaigns. And what the Democratic nominee has to hope, whether it's Sanders or Clinton, is that young people will do that again. Because Bernie has kind of connected with young people, I think this is potentially a problem for Hillary Clinton if she becomes the nominee. She's going to have to figure out a way of mobilizing those people who supported Bernie. She's going to have to make appeals like he has, the kinds of things that young people are concerned about.
Okay. And maybe one motivating factor for her could be the decision between she and the other candidate, which could very well be Donald Trump or Ted Cruz, both of which are radical. And especially in this election campaign, we've seen a lot of what we'd say is radical or far left or far right candidates. And this highlights the deep ideological divide in our country. What does the presence of these radically right or radically left candidates symbolize about our country, and what does it mean for our democratic process?
Well, I think they're largely a response to a lot of dissatisfaction with the way politics has been working. And also the way
dissatisfied with the government
and with the economy. I mean, I would attribute Trump's success primarily to growing economic inequality and the fact that wages, that median incomes have stagnated for several decades now. Particularly, and if you look at lower income workers, people who earn lower wages, they've seen their wages decline on average since the early 2000s. I mean, it began way before the Great Recession in 2008. So you're talking about almost a generation of people who have seen their standard of living stagnate. And the less well off you are, the worse it is. Okay. Now, people who are wealthy or at the higher end of the income scale have seen their incomes grow up. We have an economy where only the rich have been getting richer, and the poor definitely have been getting poorer, and the middle class is kind of stuck, limping along. But a lot of the middle class is also seeing, declines. And I think that has generated the kind of anger that Trump is tapping into. And Bernie Sanders somewhat as well. I mean, part of his appeal to young people is that a lot of young people are concerned about their economic futures. They're starting out in jobs where they have to work for low wages for a long time before they get, even educated young people are having a hard time finding good paying jobs. And so they're responding to Bernie's message of economic injustice. And Trump is tapping into, I think, another segment of the electorate. A big part of his base seems to be people with a high school education or less. And that, by definition, in our economy means they make very low wages. And they respond to his message where he says, well, it's all because of those Mexican immigrants coming in. They're taking away your jobs, okay? And they're also making your communities unsafe. Or criticizing free trade, criticizing trade agreements and saying, all your jobs went to China, and I'm going to stop that. So I think, I would say the anger, frustration is really rooted in growing economic inequality.
Okay, and I know you mentioned Trump a bit in that part. Do you think that he as a candidate is a dangerous candidate given his history of Islamophobic, sometimes misogynistic, racist comments that people have interpreted? Do you think that having him in office, even though he says he believes what he says is brutally honest, do you think that's something we can have in the White House? Somebody who has a less filtered vocabulary, what they say is the raw of what they think.
Yes, Donald Trump is dangerous. What he represents is dangerous. I mean, the way he talks about politics is not, I think, at all helpful for our democracy. Whether or not Trump himself, I mean, if in some strange way he would become president, would in fact enact authoritarian policies, I don't know.
Could our democracy uphold that, or
I
would
think,
there be a way to stop it?
I think there are, I mean, the president, once elected, doesn't immediately gain a tremendous amount of authority over all American institutions. There's ways for institutions to, push back. And I don't see a President Trump being able, for example, to, call out the army and surround the Congress, and start arresting congressmen. I mean, I don't think people would obey those orders. There was actually a little kerfuffle a few weeks ago where Trump talked about ordering people in the military to violate the Geneva Convention, and a number of generals spoke up and said, well, we will not follow that order. It's a violation of the law. We are not obliged to follow an illegal order, and that's part of the military code. And so, Trump could be stymied by that. I'm more worried about sort of long-term trends. The other thing is that I question Trump's competence as president. I don't think he's competent enough to be a truly authoritarian leader, though he might want to be. I don't necessarily, and I could be wrong about this, because he's been a much more competent candidate than I would have expected. So I could be wrong about this, but I don't know that he would know how to implement kind of his authoritarian vision. I mean, it's easy to talk tough, but actually to do those things is something else. And I'm not sure that he really, also there's some question whether Trump is really interested in doing those things. He might be all talk and no action. We don't know yet. But I think the bigger worry is what follows Donald Trump. He has shown a path of how to gain political support that some other leader or leaders in the future could take advantage of.
And you mentioned the generals voicing their opinion against Trump, and yet no matter how much criticism or hate he gets, especially like prominent figures like Mitt Romney and other spokesmen that have voiced their opinion against Trump, he seems to be gaining support in the polls despite all of this. And even once he said that if he shot somebody, his poll numbers really wouldn't be hurt that much. Why do you think this is, that the American people don't seem to respond to people acting out against Trump, but rather to Trump himself?
Well, keep in mind that his poll numbers are those polls are among Republican voters, okay? And even among Republican voters, he doesn't have a majority. You know, in all the primaries he's won, he's, he was actually early on, everybody said he had a kind of a ceiling of support. He's kind of pushing the ceiling up,
right.
Which I think surprises a lot of us. But still, that's a minority of the country. And so I don't see a huge majority of Americans responding to Donald Trump, but he does have very strong support in a significant minority of Americans, the kinds of people I was talking about earlier.
Right.
That's why he probably will be, if he's the nominee, a horrible general election candidate, because he's not going to attract a lot of independents. A lot of moderate Republicans are not going to support him. I mean, I would predict, I'm sticking my neck out a bit because predictions haven't worked out well in
right.
this campaign season, but I would think that, that Trump would be trounced by a Democratic candidate. That's why the Republican establishment is so alarmed by Trump. I think some of it is genuine concern about his rhetoric and the kind of candidate he is, but also they're just thinking about, winning the election, and they know that Trump would be a disaster for the Republican Party. He already has been a disaster for the Republican Party.
Right. And going back to what the Democrat or Republican Party, how it could be affected by Trump as the nominee, what do you see as an effective solution? I know a lot of Republicans are calling for a broker convention or something else that it would be taken to a select committee. What do you think would be an effective solution to make sure that Republicans who are aiming to get a Republican president, to make that more feasible?
Well, their only hope is for Trump to not win enough delegates to win the nomination on the first ballot, and that's their strategy. The question is, once you establish that situation, what's going to happen? First of all, who's the alternative to Trump? It's really not. It could be Ted Cruz, but the Republican establishment doesn't like Ted Cruz either. Okay, and they don't seem to be too excited about John Kasich. I think there are some Republicans who think they can parachute in some other person, Mitt Romney or Paul Ryan, and nominate that person. But that would be a very tough sell to bring in somebody who hasn't run in any primaries at all, when you've got two candidates, Trump and Cruz, who have won quite a few states. And if Trump and Trump himself has said that, if I'm just short a few, 100 or so delegates, what's it going to look like to my supporters if you deny me the nomination? I mean, I think it's a big unknown how you would manage that situation and what the outcome would be. I think they'd have a hard time denying Trump the nomination if he's even close.
And going to a more technical aspect of the election process, and among individual candidates, a lot of them have policies that are somewhat radical. In the case of Bernie Sanders and Marco Rubio had a very serious fiscal policy. Is there any policy that you've examined or looked at that is really different, or something that we haven't seen, or could really change what we look like as a nation?
Not allowing Muslims to come to the United States, building a wall, and deporting 11 million undocumented workers. Those are policies that nobody's proposed up to now.
Yeah.
I mean, those are the ones that are brand new and amazing. I think, more seriously, you're saying, are there serious policy ideas that have
Foreign
come
policy.
coming out of the campaign, and really not. I mean, I think I do think Bernie Sanders has some serious policy ideas. I don't know how feasible they are, but they're certainly he's certainly raised topics that the Democratic Party is going to, and if Hillary Clinton's the nominee, she's going to have to address them. The problem of high college debt. She has her own plan. She doesn't want to provide free college the way Sanders does, but she clearly, knows that's an issue that has to be addressed. Maintaining access to health care. Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All is not going to get enacted, but I think Hillary Clinton has to make clear that she is going to support strongly at least as much access that has occurred under the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare.
And so her policy is to reform that to make it work, but not to start from scratch. Is that correct? Or how are they?
Right. Well, actually, she's been she has talked about reforming. I think she's supporting the Affordable Care Act the way it's been enacted, and making sure that it's not done away with. I think something has to be done about trade policy. And that doesn't mean necessarily overturning trade agreements, but I do think more attention has to be made to the harm that trade agreements do for some segments of the workforce. And that has not gotten sufficient attention. That's why so many people have lost their jobs and are not at better jobs, angry. They're on the fringes, and this hasn't been talked much about in the presidential campaign itself, but there has been interesting discussions in sort of think tanks and universities and colleges and even in Congress about policies to promote supporting the wage structure. The most common thing talked about is raising the minimum wage, and both Sanders and Clinton are in favor of doing that. Bernie wants to raise it higher than Hillary, but they both are in favor of a higher minimum wage. That would support the wage structure. Other ideas involve things like increasing what's called earned income tax credit. That's a tax credit that low-wage workers get, that they, if they're working and their income is below a certain level, when they file their tax return, they get a supplement to their income. Okay. Another idea. So that's taking people's wages and giving a government subsidy to supplement incomes.
Right.
Other people look at it the other way. What we need to do is to create conditions so that the market creates higher wages before there are government subsidies. A minimum wage does that. But there are other things that people have talked about, things like providing wage subsidies to employers. And so that would be government, instead of providing an income supplement to workers, go to certain employers and say, we will give you a tax break or maybe a direct government grant in certain industries if you pay your workers a certain level.
All right.
Okay.
That makes sense.
And then there's a whole host of policies that would involve beefing up education and training.
Of course. In your opinion, what is the state of the union? Are things looking up, or should we see a decline? Do you expect by this time next year, or even a few years down the road?
Well, at this moment, it's hard to say the state of the union is all that great.
Right.
I mean, with this presidential campaign, which has been pretty ugly. I think in the long run, I'm an optimist by nature, but I think there's a lot of things to be optimistic about. Partly because of your generation. I think the younger generation really is approaching a lot of the problems of the country in a serious way, and are open to innovative kind of ways of thinking about it. Okay, the fact that they're responding to, some at least are responding to Bernie Sanders, suggests that these are people who are, open to change.
Right.
The other thing about your generation too is that I think we still have a very serious problem in this country around race. And although your generation is not perfect on race, okay, there certainly seems to be more of a sense of tolerance, a willingness to work across races in your generation than in older generations. And I'm hopeful about that. I think it's been in the long run, it'll be very constructive that there's been a lot of mobilization in the African American community around police violence against African American men, especially the Black Lives Matter movement. I think has a potential for really getting America to address, the serious racial issues that we need to address.
And so from a social aspect, do you think that there will be improvements, or especially as you said with our generation trying to address this, do you think that real change will be enacted, or is it all surface level?
Yeah, I'm hopeful that there'll be some real changes happening. My biggest worry for the future is the warming planet.
Right.
I mean, and that is a really serious problem. But again, it's your generation that's taking that seriously. And you obviously have more at stake.
Absolutely.
So you're probably going to live to the end of the century when recently one scientist was predicted that coastal cities will be underwater. That's something we've got to work on.
And if you could describe this election in 3 words, let's say, what were the 3 words you would use?
Surprising is one. Ugly is another one. Fascinating as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time, Professor
Thank you.
Hudson, and hopefully you enjoy Lawrenceville, and it was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.